I'd just like to first start off by welcoming everyone and thanking you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few items just to make sure that you get the most out of today's discussion. So as we get started, as you're doing now, please continue to just say hi in the chat, introduce yourself. We just love to know where our attendees are joining us from. Today's session is being recorded and we're going to share it via email along with some other helpful resources to all the registrants and attendees. So that should follow within a week probably. Today's discussion is going to be broken up into 3 different parts or segments. And after each one, we're going to pause just for a few minutes to have the panelists answer any questions that you may have before we move on to the next segment. If you have questions for our speakers, would you please go ahead and put those in the chat as well? And we'll try to get to as many of them as time allows. But, if we can't get to any of those, we'll make sure to follow up with your questions by email afterwards. There is also, I just want to let you know, going to be a brief survey about today's discussion, and we will share it right after the end of this webinar. And if you have a few minutes to spare, we would really love your feedback. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so my name's Lynn Riverstone. I'm going to be the moderator of today's discussion. And just a tiny bit about me, I'm a former mathematics instructor. I used Gradescope myself. The topic of today's discussion is Gradescope. And then I was an academic technologist and I supported other faculty who use Gradescope. And I've been here at Turnitin for about 1.5 years. Today, I am joined by this incredible group of instructors who've all been successfully implementing Gradescope, which is a grading and feedback platform, into their own teaching and courses. And our purpose today is to have them share some of the common challenges that instructors face with grading and assessment and why Gradescope is a solution that'll make a difference in your class. So let's have each of them introduce themselves first off. We'll go in the order that you see on the slide here, Lacey, and then Laura, and then Amelia. So let's just hear a little bit about who they are.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lacey Gerhardt. I'm an assistant professor of teaching in the Department of Evolution and Ecology at UC Davis. And I use Gradescope in a variety of classes, mostly in my large enrollment intro biology course.
Great, thanks, Lacey. Laura?
Hello, everybody. I'm Laura Tucker. I'm a math professor at Central Piedmont Community College, which is located in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been here about 22 years, using Gradescope for approximately the last 6. I use it in most of my classes, the majority of my classes being face-to-face, although, of course, with the pandemic, I've had my share of online and hybrid classes as well.
All right, and Amelia.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I'm currently doing my postdoc in Glasgow, but I was Lacey's TA at Davis, where I was first introduced to Gradescope and loved it, and then actually also used it when I was serving as instructor of record. So I've sort of seen it from both sides in that perspective.
All right, wonderful, thank you. So before we get into our panel discussion, I just first wanted to give a very quick overview of how Gradescope works so that anyone in the audience who may not be familiar with the platform just has a little bit of an idea. So what is Gradescope? Gradescope helps instructors provide their students with feedback on different types of assignments. These can be either what we call templated, that could be like an exam or a quiz that you give on paper. So the instructor would scan that and upload it to Gradescope for grading. Or it could be variable length, like a homework assignment or a project that the students themselves submit. And it can even be like a coding assignment. So this image, for example, shows the workflow for a student submitted homework assignment. So students can use the Gradescope mobile app, take a photo of their handwritten work, and then upload that directly to Gradescope. The next step is then that the instructor would grade the digitized assignment using Gradescope's rubric and provide their students with really detailed and rich feedback. And it allows them to maintain consistency in their grading across all the students. And once the grading's done, the instructor is able to just send those grades and feedback instantly to students so that they can review the feedback and understand, what they need to do to take their learning to the next step. And finally, the instructor then gets also very detailed analytics at the question level, down to the rubric item level, that helps them understand, their students' learning and how they can improve their own teaching. Okay, so that's just a quick overview. We're going to get more details from our panelists, but let's do that now. Okay, so I'm seeing in the chat someone's seeing a black screen. I'm wondering if the slides are projecting like this. All right, so let's get into the panel discussion now. As I mentioned earlier, there's going to be 3 segments. This first one is to hear from our panelists about what assessment was like pre-Gradescope. So for each of you, would you tell me a little bit about what assessment looked like for you before Gradescope? So how were you grading? And for Lacey and Laura, what was your role as an instructor? And Amelia, you've had both an instructor and a TA role, but tell us what it was, what you were doing as far as assessment as a TA. And how did you manage the collaboration between graders if you had multiple graders? Why don't we start with you, Lacey?
Right, so I'll focus on, like I said, the large enrollment intro class, though I do use Gradescope in a variety of courses. But I found that it especially was impactful in the big class, which is why I'll focus on that. So before the pandemic, but the pandemic, that's where we really took off with Gradescope. But before I started using Gradescope before even that. So before we started using Gradescope, we did have a team of TAs who assist with grading of exams. That's the real push in that class, is the exam grading, because we want to give them fast feedback, and it's high stakes. And so I wasn't grading solely myself, which meant that we had a couple of meetings among the grading team to talk about how to assign point values and stuff. We were already able to include some short answer questions, not just multiple choice, because we had that grading team, but there were a lot of logistical issues with this. It was complicated to trade exams between the individual graders. It was complicated to hand the exams back to students after they were graded. It was complicated to get any sense on my end of what students were doing right or wrong on individual questions. And it was hard for students to get any feedback on why they missed points, in part because all of this was such a smash to get a grade back to them in a timely fashion, that of course the TAs don't have time to write out a lot of descriptions on every question about why you missed 1 or 2 points here. And I don't have time to sit with the exams for a few days and sort of wallow in what they were doing well on and what they weren't, right? So there was a not great communication between any of the pieces of the people who care about that outcome.
Great, thanks. Laura, how about you?
I'm fortunate being at a community college to have small classes. So all of my classes are capped at 30. And, but all of my assessments prior to Gradescope were all paper and pencil. I'm a math instructor, so show your work kind of problems. That I would carry that big stack of papers around, carry it home every night till they're all finally graded. I would grade typically 1 page at a time. That was my way of trying to ensure consistency and speed up the process. Obviously, grading the entire test 1 person at a time would not be efficient. So that was my way to try to speed it up and be consistent in my grading. But I have to admit, I was grading based on what I call gut. Like, oh, that's a sign error, that's a 1-point error. I did not have a rubric, and that was one thing that Gradescope changed for me.
All right, and Amelia.
Yeah, so I've graded in a variety of different classes. And I think the thing that both sticks out to me that was always frustrating with grading, and that was a big both sort of time suck and also something that felt stressful, was when you're grading in a big team, is also just getting the exams where they need to get, like to who they need to be graded from. And especially when you're a grad student, I think, and like, your office situation may be a little weird and you're moving around constantly and you're sort of texting back and forth between a team of graders, and you're like, okay, I need to grade this question and I need like this package of exams, and like, do you have any that are left over? And we're biking to each other's houses at night trying to switch exams back and forth. And both that feels like a waste of time, and it also feels like a very stressful thing where you're like, here are these very important documents that we're just like moving around and hoping they all end up in the right place. That always put a lot of pressure, I think, and undue stress from the TA's perspective, for sure.
Great. Okay, so you each talked about some of the challenges that you faced with the workflow pre-Gradescope. So what was it that prompted you to look for a different way to do all of this? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what Gradescope, what was it about Gradescope that prompted you to try that specific solution? We could start with Laura on this one. How about we'll do that? We'll change the order a little bit.
I don't know that I was so much looking for something, although always I have my eyes and ears open for anything that's going to save me time, but it came to me kind of. My son was an undergrad at Berkeley where the Gradescope was developed, and I don't think it was even out there on the marketplace yet. And so I saw it from his point of view and I wanted to try it. I got permission to have an account. I created a dummy account and just enrolled him as my only student just to get a feel for it. But now I've already forgotten your entire question, Lynn.
Well, just what prompted you to look for a different way, and what was it about Gradescope that made you want to give it a try?
The thing that made me want to give it a try, I could see it was going to be easy to set up. I watched the videos on the website. They were very easy to follow. And I found the number one thing that hit me right off the bat is that it took this job of grading that at that point I'd been teaching 15 years or so, that was boring, drudge work. It's still not exciting, no bells and whistles go off, but it made it have an element of fun. I can't tell you, even now, the magic of when I upload a test and it automatically knows the student name that's written on that paper, that does not to this day cease to amaze me. I love to watch it assign the papers to the students. So it added an element of fun and efficiency for sure.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that grading is fun with Gradescope, which is nothing I would have said as a math instructor before I used Gradescope. How about you, Amelia? I'm not sure how much you were involved in choosing Gradescope for the course that you were a TA for, but I know you got to choose it for one of the classes that you taught. So what is it that made you decide to use Gradescope for that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can let Lacey talk a little bit more about why she chose it for class. I was there when she chose it and was definitely pushing her for it. I think it was sort of a joint, like me being like, I want that as a TA. But when I was teaching my own class, it was a no-brainer for me. Like having used it with Lacey, I was like, there's no other way to grade, especially as a new teacher when I was managing my own TAs. And I think it's really stressful when you're first teaching that, like I knew there were friends of mine who were TAing for me and they were helping with all the grading. And I respect them, they're brilliant people, but it's still really stressful letting that grading go out of your hand, especially early on when you're like, oh, I want everything to go right and I want to have control over things. And so being able to look at their grades and really decide like, okay, this is actually the amount of points, like we want to shift those points around. That was really important to me as an early teacher, that I didn't feel like I had an innate sense when I was telling my TAs what to do. I didn't feel like I even had an innate sense when I started grading exactly how many points I wanted for different deductions and how we were going to sort of divide a question down. And so having that flexibility was something that really spoke to me when I was making a decision for my own class.
Great, thank you. How about you, Lacey? What prompted you to look for a different way to do what you were doing pre-Gradescope, and what was it about Gradescope that prompted you to use that specific solution?
Yeah, so unlike Laura, I was looking for something else because I was really bothered by the lack of a window into how students were operating on the exams, right? The data I would get back was basically a distribution of total grades on the exam. And so I had very little information about what individual questions students were struggling with, and more important for my instruction, how they were getting things wrong. Because even when I had data on point values on individual questions, it was just an average score or a distribution of scores. I didn't get any information back on what they were doing wrong. And the students also weren't getting any information back on what they were doing wrong. So I thought we were really missing an important piece of the purpose of assessments, which is helping us know how everyone is understanding things. And so I was looking for a way to try to do that. And I should say, I've said that it was a large enrollment class. This class sees over 1,300 students every quarter. So we're dealing with an enormous magnitude of students. And if they're not getting the feedback they need, that's hurting a lot of people in terms of their education, but it also means it's really hard to find something that gives us that window that isn't just an inordinate amount of work. And so I was actually at a conference, the Society for the Advancement of Biology Education Research, and Gradescope had a little workshop. They had a booth at our, the little set of vendors and stuff. And they invited folks at the conference to just come kind of see a tutorial, play around with the system and see what it was like. And I was very excited by this. Amelia was at the conference with me, and I brought her specifically for the TA perspective, because I was like, I am excited about this, but you're the one who would be grading in this system, and I want your perspective too. And I distinctly remember we're sitting at the table listening to the little thing. They're showing us the various tools in Gradescope. And every time they show a new little trick or tool, Amelia turns around and goes, oh my God, you have to use this. This is so amazing. So the fact that I was excited about it and it would give me things I needed, but also from a logistical point of view, the person who would be in it most was also like, this is going to revolutionize our grading lives, really carried a lot of weight.
Great, thank you. Yeah, our TAs were the ones at my institution that pushed us to use Gradescope too. If it wasn't for them, I'm not sure we would have considered it. But okay, so here we are at the end of our first segment, and we've heard a little bit about the challenges that our panelists faced. I'm just curious if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, what are some of the challenges that you're facing with assessment and grading? Just love to hear what you have to say about that. And Bernadette did ask a question about clarifying how Gradescope works. They wrote, it seems that the software will store individual scores on questions, as well as store instructor feedback that can be used for student responses on the same question. And that's totally right, Bernadette. That's how it works. I don't know if any of the panelists want to add to that understanding.
I will, because that's one of my favorite parts. That's exactly what I was looking for in something. On any question, multiple choice, short answer, any kind of question, you create rubric items that have the point value or the point deduction for that type of answer. And so what I love is you can put a lot of detail in that rubric item that will tell students like, we took off a point because you didn't discuss the connection between these two ideas, or we took off 2 points because of this particular problem in the answer, what you're missing. And so that's been really helpful for students because they get that feedback about, oh, I missed points because of this particular thing, which has tanked my regrade requests because students now understand a little bit better why points were taken off and understand that it's valid. What I like as the instructor is that I can go to any individual question and it will show me a graph of 30% of students got this particular rubric item and 12% of students got this rubric item. And so that will tell me of the various ways that students could miss points on this question, this many students were making this mistake and this many students were making this mistake. And that's what I was missing when we were paper grading, that I didn't know why students were missing, what types of mistakes they were making. And now that's super easy to see on every single assignment we do.
Thanks,
yeah, and I would just add, like, it's also nice that you can, like, your rubric is editable as you go. It's not something you have to come up with ahead of time, then you're locked in. So if you come up with a problem that didn't exist before, you're like, oh, here's this error that's never been made before. This is what I want to do with that. And then you have that stored. And then also from a TA's perspective, you're like making your own rubric and you're like, well, I think that probably they would lose 2 points for this part of that problem being wrong. But then you can like talk later on and be like, okay, so this is how many points I was taking off. Does that seem right? And the instructor can be like, ooh, that's actually maybe a little bit too harsh, or like, ooh, no, that's really a fundamental thing. We should change that point structure. And then that'll change all of the exams that have been graded with that point. So you get sort of big control all throughout the process.
Yeah, the flexible rubric is one feature that instructors consistently tell us that they love, being able to update the rubric throughout the grading process.
And when you're dealing with a grading team, I find that really helpful because it takes the pressure off of an individual grader to make those decisions about how impactful is this type of wrong answer. They can basically just categorize the types of answers and then I'll come in there saying, okay, like Amelia said, this is a critical point. That's worth a lot of a deduction, but this is kind of nuanced, or we didn't cover that in a lot of detail. So that'll be worth a smaller point value. And Amelia doesn't have to make that decision like I can.
Yeah. All right, so let's go on to segment 2 here, which may be a little bit of a longer segment. This is where we want to hear from the panelists about their implementation process. So the first question I have for each of you, and why don't we start with you, Lacey, on this one. What did that first step look like? How did you get started using Gradescope? Did you have any kind of support and training that you needed to provide to your TAs, or were there any resources that you found particularly helpful for this implementation piece?
Yeah, so Laura mentioned going in and kind of having a trial run before you actually used it with students. And I did the same thing. My class is big enough that we have a couple of full-time staff members who are there to assist with the logistics of the course. And so we made a sandbox class and we fiddled with all of the things and we tried to break every aspect of it, right? Like, how can we do this wrong in a way that ruins something? Because with 1,300 students, whatever weird thing can possibly happen will happen. And so we played around a lot with those sort of settings. And especially once we got into the pandemic and we were using more of the online assignments, we were playing around with all of the things about the deadlines and the late deadlines and, you know, how we do time extensions. And so we just got in there and played around with all of them. Even now, I add myself to all of my classes on our LMS and on Gradescope as a student from a Gmail address so that I can see what the students see and try things out the way they see them kind of before it goes live to all of them. And that made it a lot easier to understand kind of how the students are interacting with it and just how it operates. When I started it with the big class, one of our unofficial rules is that, you know, we as the faculty can't just dump a ton of extra work on the staff. So the first quarter I used it, I had to do everything myself. I could have the graders still do the assistance on the short answer, but instead of having Scantron, I did all of the grading of the multiple choice myself. I did all of the scanning of the exams myself, because this was kind of a test run about how much work is this. And it was way less work than I was anticipating. The funny thing was a lot of the other folks who knew I was trying this out were like, oh, if you have to scan all of those in, like, you'll do this one exam and you'll never use it again. And I can personally scan a 12-page exam of a 500 student section in like 45 minutes. It's not as terrible of a step as it sounds like. In particular, enough people on my campus in my department were interested in this. And so we got a high throughput scanner that's dedicated just to like running exams for Gradescope so that it goes a little bit faster. And so some of those little steps like that took some trying out and fiddling with. But I remember our coordinator was sitting there while I was doing the multiple choice questions in Gradescope. And he was like, I think you're actually faster than the Scantron grading machine. Like, this is how quickly it goes. And like Amelia said, it's much easier to change things after the fact. If I decide, like, it's happened that a student will say, actually, you said the answer was B, but then this thing in class that you said kind of, we could interpret C as a right answer too. And I can go back and fix that in Gradescope really easily. Whereas on a Scantron, it's rescanning all of the things, redoing all of the calculations. And so fixing mistakes is way easier on that front too.
Thank you. Laura, you mentioned kind of how you started using Gradescope and using your son as a student in your sandbox site. But when it came to like actually implementing it in your course, could you talk a little bit about what that first step looked like, how you got started? What were there any resources you could recommend to the audience that were really helpful to you in that part?
I found the getting started videos on the Gradescope site to be very helpful and very concise and explain it very well. So I had no trouble getting it set up. And then I would just try it, you know, slowly, one class on one test and see what happens. And it was probably 2 or 3 years before I finally had students do group assignments in class and they do the upload themselves. So it was very much a phased in approach, just because I'm cautious that way, but I had no issues. Nothing broke, as Lacey said.
Great, thanks. Amelia, so how easy was it for you as a TA for you to start using Gradescope?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely benefited from having Lacey around who was like worrying about all of the things that might possibly break. And from a TA's perspective, I think it's definitely easier to learn to grade on Gradescope than it is to learn to grade in real life, because so many of the things that are hard about learning to grade are things like how many, like it's the things like how many points do you assign that Gradescope makes easier. And I do think, I mean, growing up with the internet, having Gradescope felt very intuitive to me. And I think that like from a TA perspective, it's a very easy jump. From the instructor side, the thing that I found the scariest was the scanning an exam, that feels stressful. Like, how is that going to work? And because actual paper is something I don't deal with very much in my life. And that was helpful, definitely having someone who was like on the ground with me that I could talk to Lacey and be like, how does this work? Where is our scanner? How does this system function? But that's also something that just having a like departmental person who knows how things like scanners work that you could go to and ask them. It doesn't have to be Gradescope specific. It's just figuring out like how to get that type of thing functioning.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now kind of we talked about the implementation, just the getting started piece. Looking back now, how did Gradescope allow you to improve your assessments or your assessment process? What did it enable you to do with your assessments? So, you know, we can look at this from the educator side, the TA side, the student side. What did it enable you to do? Laura, you want to start this one?
One thing it enabled me to do was get papers back into students' hands faster. Not that I was necessarily grading them in you know, a shorter number of days or whatever, but if I finished it on a Saturday with the hit of one button, everybody had their results back and they didn't have to wait till they saw me in class the next time, which also means I didn't have to keep carrying papers around for the people that didn't show up to collect their paper that first time. So I love that aspect. It let me grade in a way that's more efficient especially for a math person, meaning grading one question at a time where I had been grading one page at a time. That ensured more consistency. I didn't have to think through what was happening, going from one problem to the next, because I'm grading the same exact problem over and over again. And then it made me more consistent in the fact that it made me create that rubric that both made me think more critically about how much is this error really should be worth, and helped me over time write it in such a way that it's providing more feedback. Probably in the beginning it was -1 sign error. It probably didn't say very much, honestly, but over time, you know, I got smarter about that, realized I can reuse these rubrics however many times I want, so it's worth my time to make them very robust. It helped me collect data so that I could see, you know, if a lot of students were missing a particular problem like Lacey was talking about, and typically it'd be something that I know is part of the course. It's not like some random topic that I threw in there just because I'm in love with it. So I know I needed to test on that. I know I covered it, but maybe I just didn't ask the question in the right way. So it made me go back and relook at the way the questions were worded. And then another thing that I really like is you can pull up student work in class if you want to use that for discussion. So you can make the setting to where the students are anonymous. I can go in, randomly pull up a person's paper, navigate to whatever problem number I want. We can look at it together and see, you know, what happened and talk about it without any room for embarrassment. It doesn't even have to be someone in that particular class. It could be something from last semester or whatever. But being able to share actual student work and have a what went wrong discussion is super valuable.
Interesting. Thank you. Lacey, how about you?
Yeah, most of it relates to that communication aspect that I mentioned before, between the sort of three prongs of the exam situation, which are the students, me, and the graders. While we're grading, I often have the graders create a rubric item that just says like, Lacey, check this if there's something super weird, or sometimes they flag something they think might be cheating or whatever. And so they can see if there's something I need to come in and look at or, you know, oversee, then they can do that. That's also been helpful for a grader to then realize if they're flagging like half the questions with Lacey, check this, then we need to have a conversation about what I expect from that question and kind of recalibrate where we're at. It also gives me a lot more oversight into how the grading is progressing. On every question, there's a page that shows you what % have been graded or not. And so I can see who's in there working and who's not, and I can send some tactful nudges to the folks who maybe aren't making timely progress. And I can surreptitiously pop in and see what's been graded and make sure that it's both how I want the question to be graded and that it's consistent. I have a couple of times run into things where like the grading does kind of shift in how hard it is or how consistent it is on a question. And I can pop in and tell that person, hey, actually, like, let's go back and revisit some of these before they've graded the entire question on 1,300 students and they think that they're done, which is understandably very frustrating to the TA to have to go back to that. And so we can catch problems before they come out. I have a better sense of what the students are doing. They get more feedback. Like Laura said, in some of the questions, when there's a consistent kind of mistake that students are making, I can give a lot of detail in that rubric item. Like, okay, you're mixing up these two concepts and here's how they're different. And here's a description in the rubric item of why that's a problem. And so they get that feedback in a lot of detail without me having to write it out on 500 exams. And we haven't mentioned this yet, but I said before that you can see the stats by question about different rubric items that the students got. You can also tag each question with particular like subject tags and then look at the data by tag. So I do things like tag all the questions that are multiple choice, that are short answer, that have a figure they have to interpret, and then I can get a sense of how students are doing on those different types of questions. And that's how I figured out, we changed the prereqs for my class about 2 years ago. And that's how I figured out that since they weren't having a class prior to mine, the students were really lost on some of the cell and molecular stuff because they no longer were taking that class prior to my class, which is focused on ecology and evolution. And so when we were getting into inheritance components about how meiosis operates and what's happening at like the DNA cellular level, they hadn't had that in college yet. And a lot of the students were really confused on how that operated. And so then I added in some more content on like making sure we kind of have a refresher on what's going on at that scale to bring that component back into the class. And so it's been really helpful for me in the sort of reflective teaching feedback loop about like, where are students struggling and how can I then teach it better the next time, or cover that in office hours, or post some sort of supplementary stuff that addresses that during the class, right? Not waiting till the end.
Great, thank you so much. So Amelia, what did Gradescope allow you to do to improve your assessments or your assessment process?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things Lacey touched on, I love that you get to write really thorough feedback that you don't have to write on every student's exam if you want to give them that thorough feedback. But you also, like, I find that just like writing a rubric that you post somewhere that students can look at, they're not looking at, like, they're not going to look it up. You really want that feedback right next to it. When they're looking at their exam, you want them to have that feedback and there's no extra step. Because I also think that feedback then feels more personal to them, where they're like, oh, they're clearly answering my question and they think this applies to me. They're not looking at a rubric and trying to match their stuff to that thing. So it just gives them a lot better feedback that's much more detailed than I was given before. But it also, when I was designing my own class, Gradescope really changed the way that I thought about doing my assessments. But the class that I was instructor of record for was one that I had TA'd for previously, where there were sort of 3 exams over the course of the quarter, and that was it. And that was because it wasn't as big as Biz 2B, but it was 150 students, which is still big enough that like you can't, that passing out and returning homework takes a sizable amount of time. You really can't do smaller assignments particularly easily. And, you know, we had tried doing things like sort of like Google quiz type things, but we weren't really giving them good feedback. So it felt like it was like busy work and sort of a waste that we were giving them sort of less stressful non-exam points and chances to learn things that weren't just on the exam, but were still not particularly helpful because they weren't hearing from us. So it was just sort of a void. But with Gradescope, I was able to take some of the questions that I think had sort of traditionally been on the exam, bring those out, make it a weekly thing, and able to give them feedback that kept students much more up to date. It took some pressure off the exams, and it gave me a chance to see where were students struggling before we got to the high stakes things. So it really structured the way that I thought about designing my assessments, for sure.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. So we've been talking about kind of your own implementation process. I'm curious now about other faculty at your institution implementing Gradescope. So, you know, how did it grow? How did other instructors start using Gradescope in their courses? Were you involved in that at all? Maybe I could start with you with that, Lacey.
The short answer there is yes. I've been teased that I'm like a proselytizer for Gradescope because I love it so much. A big part of that sort of spread across campus were my graders that then grade for another class, another quarter, and pressure their faculty member to adopt this too. I found the streamlining process in a big class is huge. I've been focusing on the communication component, which I think is the most important pedagogical aspect. but the streamlining and the lack of being able to lose stuff reduces a lot of the stress, like Amelia mentioned, for the graders and for me. Like once it's scanned in there, there's no way you can accidentally lose a stack of exams or, you know, something like that. And so that for the big classes is really key. And so I have met with a variety of faculty who want to try it out, show them how to set stuff up. We have the high throughput scanner that I mentioned is technically owned by my department, but so long as no one in our department needs it, anyone who wants to use it can schedule time. And so we have a thing where you can go in and see if someone else has scheduled time to use it and actually book some time and get in there and use it too. So we also have a site license, so it's free for students. So there's no barrier except the instructor's knowledge of how to use it and interest in doing so. And so talking with me, talking with other TAs who've used it tends to get faculty over that hump and at least be willing to try it. Like Laura said, I'll do one assignment on there and kind of see how it works. And then, you know, maybe I'll just do homeworks on it this quarter and think about exams for later, and kind of easing into it a little bit has been helpful too.
Great. So Laura, at a school like yours where there might be different challenges, you have smaller classes, I know that. Is there something else you can share about how Gradescope usage grew at your school, or you know, whether you had anything to do with that?
I have no idea how many current users we have at our school. I would say it grew slowly, not which was not what I wanted. I tried pushing it. I would sell it all the time. I'm thrilled that I finally have sold it to the college, in the sense that we now have the license. It's integrated with our LMS. I think that's only for another year or so. So hopefully enough people get on board that will get renewed. But that was my biggest thing, was it wasn't just something I liked or a math thing. I was trying to get the general college population interested, and I've made a little bit of headway there.
Do you mind sharing what some of your activities were to get others interested in using Gradescope?
Oh, just lobby, bugging people's ears.
Thanks.
I should
Amelia,
add-
go ahead. Sorry, Lacey.
Well, can I pop in? We do also have an instructional technology office. And so they're kind of a voice for different tech tools and how they can be used in class. And so I went to them and was like, this is great, and we should talk about this campus wide. And so in one of their sessions, they also brought in some folks who use it to talk about how we use it, something very similar to this, but focused to our campus. And that was big for also getting faculty to kind of see how it works and how they might use it in their classes.
Thanks. Amelia, do you have any additional thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Lacey mentioned, I think that the TAs sort of did definitely infiltrate the campus, going around being like, we want this. And I definitely think when you are a TA and you show up somewhere and you're like, I want to grade this way, I'm currently doing all the grading, if I scan everything and use this, are you okay with that? It's amazing how many people will let you do the work you want to do in the way you do. So I definitely think that like that helped move it across campus a ton. Because I mean, I have tons of friends who TA as well, and like they're also all on board. That like it just changes from a TA perspective, makes things so much easier. I think it's very much a like, if you care about the people who are doing the work for you, finding solutions to help their problems is makes everybody a lot happier.
Yeah, very true, very true. Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of the end of my questions for the second segment of our panel discussion today, the implementation piece. I do see we have some questions in the chat. One, let's see, Animesh asked, and maybe Lacey, you could talk to this question. Can you share the details of your high-speed scanner? Just, I know you put a link in the chat, but would you mind talking about it a little bit too?
Sure, I'd have to look up the exact model. I think it's sort of a standard Brother or Epson scanner. It was $200 or $300. We got sort of a middle range one, so you could get one that's cheaper or a fancier one that's even faster. Before we got that, I did just use the copier in our main office that also has scanning capabilities, and that's a little bit slower, but it still worked fine. And we have one of those paper chopper things, and so the first step is to chop off the staple corner. And there was a question in the chat too about like, are you worried about losing pages like that? I have never yet had that happen. You have to be very careful from the chopping to the scanning step. That's the most dangerous step. If you trip and drop everything on the floor at that point, you're going to be in a sad place. But the way we get around that is, first of all, just being super careful at that step. And two, we have the students write their name on every page. Some of them forget, or if they at least put their initials or something, then we have some sort of record of like whose is whose. And we haven't yet ever had a problem with that if we're just really careful and pay attention.
Great. Yeah, I would add just one more tip to that, which is something we did at my school when I was using Gradescope, which is we use those big binder clips. So after we scanned, we put binder clips on those so that they couldn't fall apart after that. Amelia, did you want to add something to?
I was going to say, like, I do think, like, I think the scanning is the scariest part, which we've mentioned. And I do think, like, in terms of like implementing, like doing things slowly, doing like homework assignments that are all digital first on Gradescope is a great way to learn about the really beneficial things of Gradescope, and then gradually implement to doing exams digitally, or to scanning exams if you're doing them by paper. So I think there's like ways to like learn to use Gradescope where you don't have to do the very scary cutting of a stapler, even though it's way less scary once you're actually doing it. But then you'll already be so converted to Gradescope that you'll be like, it's fine, I'll cut any staple.
Yeah, that is great advice. Thank you.
I will say we have run into little quirky things with the scanner, which are super easy to fix in Gradescope. So if the scanner jams and it misses a page, or it duplicates a page, or one time one of the students like pulled their exam apart and put some of them back in upside down and backwards, which makes no sense. And Gradescope not only catches that that's the problem. So we scan in batches of 30 or 40 exams, and it can separate, it knows where in the PDF to separate the different exams, and then can automatically assign it to a student. And it'll flag one in big red and say like, this one seems to be missing a page, or this one seems to have duplicate pages, or something weird is happening on page 7. This looks like nonsense. And it will flag that for you, and then you can take a look. Some of it you can fix even without scanning. So like if a page is just upside down or backwards, you can manipulate it in Gradescope to fix that. And then if it has a duplicate page, or if it's missing something, we could just pull that exam back out of the stacks, rescan just that one, and replace just that student, even if it was part of a bigger batch of 40. So my absolute favorite part of Gradescope, especially in terms of these really enormous classes, is that those little mistakes are super easy to fix and super easy to find. Like in a class as big as mine, it's sometimes hard to even find that something has gotten messed up. And it helps you see that and fix it easily.
Great. All right, I think that's all our questions for this part. So let's go on to our third and final section of the panel discussion, which is about kind of looking back. Now that you've been using Gradescope for a while, what lessons have you learned? So the first question I have is, what was the main learning in this process that you want other instructors to walk away with? So anybody who's thinking now about using Gradescope, what would you want them to know? Laura, you want to start with this one?
I would say when you're writing your rubrics, if possible, although they're robust and detailed, you also want them to be somewhat generic in that that same rubric might apply for another question on that test or a future test, even though the exact wording of the problem is a little bit different. So just over time, you figure out ways to do that. When you're creating your outline, if you're using a templated exam, the first thing Gradescope has you do is set up your outline and mark where on the page each problem number should be. I find that if things are really quick and easy to grade, that it's not efficient for me to make each problem number be its own item in the outline. So I'll have number 1 in the outline actually be half of page 1, for example. And so over time, you learn those kind of tricks as well. Also, you can set up your rubric as a negative scoring or positive scoring, either way. And you can have the entire exam, it defaults to one or the other, but then a question by question, you can flip it the other way if you want to. And so over time, I've gone from a negative scoring model to a positive scoring model, because I like the fact that if there's like certain elements, you need to have these steps in order to get to the correct answer, and I need to see your work for each of those steps, then I can show you, I'm giving you points for each of those things, so that even if you get 100% on that question, if you're going back and reviewing it later at the end of the semester to prepare for the final exam, and you've forgotten what that question is all about, that feedback is still valuable to you. It's not just valuable to people who lost points. So those would be my big things. And then a huge plus is that, of course, it tallies up the score at the end, right? No more manually tallying up scores, which I would always tally at least twice to make sure I got the same answer. And oftentimes I wouldn't. So then you're tallying it 3 or 4 times. Yeah. So automatic tallying, all in favor of that.
Great, thanks. Amelia, what's your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would say one thing first, which is just be like what Laura was talking about when she was talking about the outline, is that I think this isn't actually something we've mentioned, which is that like when you're grading, you grade one question at a time, you move through all of them. And so when you're saying like on the outline, that's like which questions you're looking at, because sometimes you might actually want to grade 2 questions at a time, and that there's ways to flexibly do that. And I do think that's one of the things that's, just like troubleshooting with Gradescope is figuring out the thing that works best for you, because I do think like what you want it to do, it probably does. You just need to figure out the way to get it to do those things. Yeah, I mean, I also think that the positive negative scoring is a useful thing to think about, because I know that when I first started using it, I think I still typically use negative scoring, but I have a like -0 points that has a like summary of what a correct answer would look like, so that even students that, if you're negative scoring, if you give them the 0, they can still be like, oh, what I did right was that I hit these points. Like, here's what that thing shows me, is that like my answer hits all of these things, which is nice when they're looking back at things. Because I do think like more students than I thought go back and look at their comments when they're preparing for other exams, which has been helpful.
Great, thanks. How about you, Lacey?
I think that flexibility that Amelia mentioned is key. I've been focusing on my large enrollment intro class, which is standard exams for the most part. But I also use Gradescope in a medium enrollment upper division elective and in my lower division field course. And I use it very differently in those. I use almost entirely the online assignments. That's no scanning or whatever. The students are actually in Gradescope typing their answers out as they go. And in my upper division class, they have an assignment every class period that's something small, connecting that day's content to something outside of class, some sort of cultural conversation or something. And we usually spend a little bit of time introducing that topic, and they have a chance to kind of make some notes about what their answer would be or the conversation they're having with the folks around them, but then follow up with it later. And so it's also a storage place for their ideas as they're thinking about that answer. And then, like Laura said, I can then pull the pattern of their responses and show them in class the next day, like, here's the different things you were drawing out of this, or the points you were making. Like, here's kind of a breakdown of how the class approached this question. And then we can use that to kind of start the conversation for the next class. And then in my field course, they're often, we start in the classroom together, but then we scatter to do data collection or observation stuff all over campus. And so I'm not with most of the students, I'm with one team, or I'm popping between teams. And there you can do group submissions on Gradescope. And so one person in each team will be the documenter, and they'll post photos or some detail about what they gathered or what they measured or whatever for that activity. And then they can tag the other students in their team on it. And then I know who was where and what they were gathering. And like, that's sort of some feedback for me in a way that's super easy for the students to engage with and to document. And then they also kind of have a record of it still about who they worked with on this group and where they went or whatnot.
Neat. I like that. We did get quite a few requests in the chat for a demo. So I'm just going to jump right to our last question and then use what time we have left at the end to just show how Gradescope works and grade a quick question. So the final question I had for you. So we know there's just been an overwhelming feeling of burnout among instructors and TAs, whether it's been towards technology or teaching in general, all the work that goes into being a university professor or graduate student. So what would you say to anyone who's feeling hesitant, let's say, about trying Gradescope? I'll start with you, Amelia.
I mean, I think we've said a lot about the fact that it's easier than you think it is, but I will say, like, grading generally, both during a pandemic and otherwise, can feel not like the fun part of teaching, right? It's the part where you're just like mindlessly doing something. And I'm not saying that Gradescope totally gets rid of that problem, but I do actually think it helps me with that. Like, I find it really frustrating when I'm grading a like like 150 of the same question, it's frustrating to just be like -5, -5, -5, because like it feels frustrating that I know that the students aren't getting anything from that they're going to see and be like -5, whatever, and then just like move on. Whereas like I do like in Gradescope the ability to write them actual feedback, write something that I've like thought about a good answer and like really clearly explain something. It makes me feel like they're learning something on that question. And I definitely get less questions about my grading. So I do think that they are reading that and taking something from it. But from a me perspective, it's made me feel less burnt out about just like, this is a task versus like, this is a conversation that I'm having with students where I'm giving them feedback. And this is a valuable thing that they are getting. And I think anything that I can turn from being busy work to being something meaningful makes teaching less of a burnout task and more of the rewarding thing that I like it for. So I really appreciate that about Gradescope.
Great, thank you. Laura, what would you say to someone who might be hesitant about using Gradescope?
Well, I've already said, I think it makes it fun, or as fun as grading can possibly be, way more fun than what you're imagining with a stack of papers. And a couple of other ways that I make it additionally fun for myself is once you finish grading them and you publish the results and you shoot an email out to the students letting them know they're ready, a little eyeball shows up next to their name when they've looked at it. So it's fun to me to see, as soon as I send that email, I go look at that real quick before I log off and go do whatever else I'm doing. It's always fun to me to see, oh, 5 people have instantly gone out there and looked at it. And who are those 5 people? And, traditionally, they're going to be the same 5 people every time. And then the other thing is, as you're grading, you can jump around, even though you're grading one problem at a time or one page, however you set up your outline. If question number 37 is the easiest problem to grade and you're tired, but you want to make some progress before you go to bed, well, you just jump straight to 37. It's not any harder than grading number 2 in terms of navigating to it. So you can like balance, alternate an easy problem versus a hard problem just to mentally give yourself a break. And then last but not least, periodically, I will stop and I'll look and see, okay, 70% of the questions have been graded so far. Let me see who's in the lead. And I keep coming back to see who's in the lead. And it's like a horse race to me. And I get amusement out of that. But again, I have small classes, so I know exactly who those people are when I see their names.
That sounds really fun. How about you, Lacey? What advice would you give to a hesitant instructor?
Yeah, so I think I fall in the same sort of camp as Amelia on this, where, the last academic year, we were back to fully in person with a little bit of a kerfuffle in winter when we went back to remote for a couple of weeks. But the student burnout was off the charts, right? Attendance was terrible. Even of the students that were present, like getting conversation or dialogue to happen was really hard. And I felt like I was teaching my upper division elective this year. And I felt like our conversation was awful. The students were quiet. I felt like it's a global change class, so it's kind of depressing content anyway. I felt like everything was going terribly. And then we do these little assignments, and even the students who weren't coming were watching the recorded videos of the lectures and were just like really insightful and honest and open in their responses on there. And so like Amelia said, it didn't feel like busy work. It didn't feel like a point value hoop jumping exercise. It felt like a conversation where I could engage with them in ways that for whatever reason they were not comfortable doing in the classroom all as a group. And then I could tell them that the next day in class, like, a bunch of you said this thing in your assignment that like I hadn't thought of, and I thought that was really insightful. Let's talk about that for a few minutes here together and like deep dive into that. And so making it not this formulaic drudgery, but instead something that lets us have a conversation about the content across the whole class was really good for my own burnout and for the students.
I will also say, in terms of like Lacey's burnout, as someone who TA'd for her during the pandemic, when we were grading exams on that global change class, it was nice to be able to flag answers that I was like, oh, Lacey's gonna want to read this because it's gonna make her happy. Like, we should flag this question, like this answer was written really well, or they wrote something really funny, or it's just like, I want her to see this because I know it's going to be helpful. So I think like it's helpful to communicate with the students, and it makes it really easy to like share things as a grading team that are not just bad, but that are good also. So I think that's definitely nice.
And I'll pop in one little thing that I didn't think of when I started that it turns out has been really valuable to me, which is given that we're not handing the exams back, like I always have the assignments still to refer to, I can use those for big A assessment, right, that goes to my dean. And I can refer back to those when I write letters of recommendation for students. So a couple of times a student from a class has asked me for a letter, and I write big classes. And if it's been over a year, I rarely remember a student very well individually, but I can go back through their assignments and be like, oh yeah, I remember this answer that Amelia flagged that made me very happy. And get a better sense of the student again, which helps kind of guide then my writing of letters or supporting their professional success in other ways, right? I don't lose that connection when the class ends.
Awesome. Thank you so much, all of you. Those are great positive notes to end on. I am just going to share my screen. Is everybody seeing this Gradescope quiz that I have here? I did see a question in the chat about how the outline piece works that Laura talked about. So I've just got a quiz here. I've uploaded a PDF that shows all the different questions and where students will write their answers. And I've just drawn a box around each one, as well as where they're going to write their name and their student ID. This is just the very first step. I've scanned in the student papers and I've made sure that their names are all correctly attached to their assignments. And so now I'm ready to grade. And this is a question, the list of all the questions on the exam. I'm just going to grade this really quick math question here. So this is one where it's a short answer questions. The students just are asked, what's the integral of X? And we haven't talked about how AI can be used with Gradescope. And I'm not going to actually show you that here because I think it's kind of a big topic to get into. I'm going to grade each student's answer one at a time. So here's what the grading interface looks like. On the left-hand side, I see one student's answer to this question. And on the right-hand side, you see the rubric for this question. And by default, you always start with correct as one of the options in your rubric. And this student is correct. So I just mark that and you can see they got 3 out of 3 because I already set up that this question was worth 3 points. I can also import a rubric that's been, as Laura was commenting before, that you can reuse rubrics that you've used in the past. And then I just go on to the next student. Whoops, my little Zoom is getting in the way. And so now I see I'm grading one question at a time. This is a different student's answer to the same question. So I can build my rubric as I go and describe the student mistake here, giving them really detailed feedback however I want, and using LaTeX to format it or markdown code. I can even upload an image if I want to, but I'll say that they're missing the coefficient here and decide how many points to deduct. Or if I'm doing a positive rubric, I can add up points rather than subtracting points. So the student got their score here as well as their feedback. And I can also add text comments or tell them, this is where you were missing. This is the section of your assignment or your answer that was missing the coefficient. I can write on this if I want to. If I have a stylus and a tablet, looks a little nicer. And I can also leave comments that are not related to the rubric, like please come to office hours or something like that. It doesn't have any point deduction related with it. I'm just giving some other comments about this. And then I go on and I grade the same question right in a row. I can use keyboard shortcuts, so I can type the number on my keyboard to select that rubric item and so on. So that is just a really, really fast introduction to how Gradescope works. I do want to just, because we're out of time, go back to my slides here and share this. So we talked today, about how you can supercharge your assessments in all disciplines. Our panelists gave us some wonderful ideas about how you can provide timely feedback, include multiple assessment formats, provide frequent low stakes assessments, reduce your grading exhaustion, even make your grading fun, and increase fairness and conduct item analysis, whether that's for your own knowledge or for the big A assessment that Lacey mentioned. So I want to thank every single one of you for being here, to our incredible panelists for their time and that they put into preparing for this. If you have questions, we would be happy to talk with you after this webinar. You can feel free to send me an email, lriverstone@turnitin.com, or email our Gradescope help desk. They're awesome. They'll get back to you with any technical questions you may have, help@gradescope.com. So we finished almost on time. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been wonderful.